A very good evening to one and all present here. I'm Harshini from Proteus, the Biology Club of ISEP Thiruvananthapuram, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the second talk of our online symposium, DETA 2.0 by Ms. Chinmaya Ghanekar. The title of today's talk is Learning on the Go, and I'm very sure that we all will indeed learn quite a bit. Ms. Chinmaya is a conservative biologist who specializes in the study of marine life. She has done her master's from the Abasaheb Garware College of Arts and Science, Pune, and is currently a PhD scholar at the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. She has been working on dugongs, which are marine herbivores, and has written a paper on the diversity and unique genetic lineage of Indian dugongs. She is also involved in various efforts to conserve the marine life form. I kindly request everyone to save their questions for the end of the talk, as there will be an interactive session. Please keep your videos turned off and microphones muted throughout the duration of the talk. I would also like to thank our sponsors, MyBiome Therapeutics and JKG Bioscience, for their valuable contribution. And without any further ado, ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I guess we should start. I'm just sharing my screen. Just give me a second.
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So, hello everyone. I am Chinmaya. As the Proteus team introduced me, it is very kind of them that they have given me this opportunity to talk about whatever work I have done and whatever I have learned in conservation biology till now. It is a slight disclaimer I want to give that I am not somebody who is completely experienced in conservation biology. It's been just 5 years that I'm working in this field and learning a lot of things. That's why the title says Learning on the Go. It is absolute pleasure that I am talking about it, and I hope you resonate with it. So I'll just give my little introduction from where I have gotten interested into all this field of wildlife and conservation. So I'm uh, native to a coastal village called Anzarle in Maharashtra. So since childhood, maybe from 2 years old, that's what I remember. I am going to the sea, playing with the waves, drowning sometimes. All of that has happened, and it was always generating curiosity that what is inside there. Where are those shells coming from? Where are those waves coming from? So everything that gave me one question all the time, and I wanted to address all those questions from school. And then my parents spoiled me. So in fourth standard or fifth standard, my mother gave me this CD, Finding Nemo, and I was obsessed with it, literally obsessed. And I don't know how many times I've seen that movie. Now I may say that it is scientifically wrong at few places, but right at so many. So it has given me such an inspiration to go and explore everything underwater. So here I am currently working as PhD student in Wildlife Institute of India, working on seagrass habitats, dugongs, and associated fauna. So today, the Proteus team has given me a task of talking about conservation biology. It is one huge subject which I don't know if anyone can fit into 1 hour talk. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what I have understood in all these years. I hope you will get it, and please ask me questions because those are the most important part of it. So, As far as I understand conservation biology of any conservation of any species, habitat, landscape, any conservation for that matter, consists of a lot of things. It's not one science or one answer. There is no correct answer to it. So there are a lot of things involved where research and awareness is one part, then where the governments and other bigger stakeholders come in, where the policies are made and how we should go about it is written somewhere, and finally the implementations by, say, forest department, fishery department, or all the departments and the people involved in it. So all of the concoction of just lead to conservation. It's all of it, the balance of it, the mixture of it, everything, I would say. So there are different approaches of wildlife biology or conservation biology. Here are some by Gomberg et al. They have written a paper in Nature and they have tried to kind of explain what approaches are there. So utilitarian approach says that the best outcome for every stakeholder there. So stakeholders are basically everything that is concerned to that problem. So stakeholders are the animals we are conserving or plants we are conserving, the people who are living there, the people who are indirectly dependent on it, plus the government. Everybody is a stakeholder in that problem. So utilitarian might give the best outcome for all, which is difficult for sure, but it might give a best outcome. Then there is other approach called animal rights, which is mainly given into laboratory context, but it is also very privy in context of Wildlife Protection Act, which is formed by Government of India, and there are so many animals and plants protected under that act. So animal rights, where we give moral rights to animals, or we consider that there are moral rights to those animals and we cannot harm them, we cannot kill them, or we cannot exploit them. So that kind of approach is called animal rights approach. Then there is one approach called nature, which is more of a preservation approach. So everything that is there in nature should be conserved as it is. So that is one very natural approach, or not interfering kind of approach. But many a times I would say that it is not impossible, but it is extremely difficult to go about this approach, as we are also part of it and we need our needs have to be met. So preservation is very difficult. Next would be contextual, in context with humans. So what humans need or what that community needs. So in context to that, the problem is taken into hands. And then there is a hybrid approach where all of these can be mixed and matched, and problem-based solutions can be given. So in all of this, the only thing is balance. It is very important to have that balance of what are you going to conserve, or what are you going to see in that bigger picture. So many a time this cartoon says a lot, because we think of a small problem and maybe one part of it and miss out on so many of those might be not seen at that time, but are important for everybody's goodwill. So when we talk about conservation biology, as I already said, it is mostly problem based. So in my abstract, I have also said that there is no correct solution. There can't be, because there are so many animals, so many plants, so much of diversity. Everything is different from each other. Everything may not be understood correctly all the time. So we need to set goals and targets to the conservation. So it's like a popular saying that it's not only conservation, it's conservation management. So we manage most of the things. maybe those resources, maybe the area. That's why there are wildlife managers and courses regarding that. So it is all problem based, and everything is connected to each other. So you first identify the problem, the area, the concerned species or habitat or landscape, whatever it is, and then go about it, assess the compile the data, assess it. Then if you want to do some predictions, you can do it, and then maybe try to find a policy which best fits all. And then there are many things that assessing vulnerability of it, then how much time you have for conserving that, everything that comes into with your goal and targets. So it is all about prioritization and how you go about the problem. So when we talk about conservation, tigers are the most known in India, at least most known as the conservation is called successful because of many things. But that was not possible without the technology we have right now in conservation. It is so much important that we have those cameras, we have recording instruments, we have different things that I'll be going to talk about briefly, that how this technology is a integral part of wildlife conservation nowadays. So best known by everybody is camera trapping. So this, if you can see in the left picture, there is a camera trap and one person is setting that camera trap. There are so many statistics involved in it, that how it should be placed, at what height, at in what area. So according to that, the camera traps are placed, and they give wonderful results. I mean, not every time it is possible for a human to go in an area, observe that animal all the time. So cameras work the best, and there are two really popular and successful examples of camera trapping. Is one is melanistic tiger. We got to know about melanistic tiger in Simlipal Tiger Reserve by the camera traps put by Forest Department and WI. So we got to know that okay, there is something, that genetic variation is there in tigers as well, which was not seen before. Also, in 2019, there was a tiger sighted at Sikkim. If you are uh, like interested in traveling and everything, you know how Sikkim is and how the terrain is. It's extremely mountainous, difficult, and at that height and that kind of snowy atmosphere, a tiger was found, which was a huge part of the conservation, where those areas need to be prioritized now for tiger conservation, which we knew because of camera trapping. So this is a method which is used extensively for land mammals in India and abroad. And I'm so proud to say that Wildlife Institute of India holds one Guinness Book of World Record for largest camera trap survey in the world. So the last tiger census happened. It was the largest camera trap survey, and you can check out the report on website. They have done some fantastic work, and it is so inspirational. So with that, we have tried camera trapping underwater also. There are so many institutes outside which do camera trapping underwater already, but in India, we are trying this camera trapping. I would say this is one of the few tries that had happened in India. So this is the on the left side, the camera you see in the grass patch is a GoPro. We are trying that with a GoPro, and it is unweighted video. So what we do is we put on a tripod, we mount that camera and put it for 45 minutes to 1 hour and record everything without disturbance. So we can see what fish are there, what other animals are coming in there, what activities they are doing. So a lot of animals have different behaviors. As humans, animals also have different behaviors which may not be seen all the time. So camera traps give us that tool to like peep into their lives and see what are they actually doing. So, for example, there are some fishes which are extremely shy, so they literally hide in those grasses when we are there as divers. And in camera traps, in those same videos, in might be the same area, we see they are feeding in those grasses or moving around or searching for the prey. So we actually get to know a lot of information with these camera traps, and we are going to like further uh, improve our model of camera trapping. So there is another type of camera trapping which is baited underwater video. So if you can see the orange rod in the right picture, uh, there is one mesh attached to it. So there is prey in that, and fishes or other animals will come to that prey to eat it or to smell it or just to guess what it is, and they will be captured, and the behavior can be observed with these kind of videos. So this is uh, one a little advanced method for camera trapping underwater, but as of now we are not that technologically advanced as on land we are, but it is difficult to keep those in underwater. So I would recommend, there is one Twitter handle called Coral City Camera. They have permanent camera traps underwater, and they put beautiful videos of fish, manatees, and whatnot. I guess you should check it out if you are interested. Then one very popular method I would say is satellite telemetry, where you put a satellite tag on one animal. There are different types of tags. One is attached permanently, as in with a glue or something on the back of animals, or there are collars for land animals where they are tranquilated, and then a collar is put around them. So there are different types of tags according to different animals. So this is one glue tag on the turtle. Uh, this is one olive ridley turtle. In India, there are tries of putting tags on the turtle to see where that animal goes, because the habitats, the depths these animals go to, or say on the land of dense forest these animals go to, it is near to impossible to go into that habitat and see what they are doing. So it is a how it is an indirect method of knowing what habitats they are using. So in case of turtles, if you can see here, one turtle from Chennai has gone up to almost Andaman, might be feeding there, might be doing reproduction and coming back. So I guess the satellite tag is lost here, or the battery is ended, whatever can happen. So we got to know so much information from this, that how these turtles are traveling, what paths they are using. So it is very important in a sense to know this path, because as a country we are heavily dependent upon fishing. A lot of us might be eating fish from this panel, I'm not sure, but we are very heavily we have very heavily fished waters, and the fishing load or the nets or the boats are so much that these animals literally need to dodge them and find their way through. So it is very important to know how these animals are using these pathways to understand uh, or to plan the conservation of them. So satellite telemetry aids us to know about the habitat usage or area usage of an animal, uh, to to manage that conservation. The next very important part of it, which we all use actually from Google Map, but it's a very important tool in conservation biology, which is GIS. It is the satellite imagery which is used for understanding the habitat, for understanding the components of the habitat, and what areas we should prioritize, what areas we should kind of manage differently. All of that those kind of answers can be given from GIS. So this is one example by my colleague and the team, Campa Dugong team. So they have done detection and mapping of seagrass meadows in Richie's archipelago, which is a part of Andaman. So Andaman is one island group which has extensive depths, and sometimes it's very difficult to dive in those areas because maybe weather or crocodiles, which are like lethal to humans, or maybe availability. Many things are there where we get stuck as researchers for collecting data. So these kind of tools help us understand the habitat while we are sitting in our labs. So this particular study kind of maps and detects seagrass areas around the Neil Island, which is Shahid Dweep now. It detects those areas. So now we can prioritize which areas where we can survey, which areas are there where we can find most amount of seagrasses, and do our surveys, prioritize it basically. And from this we can also guess if there is any dugong population there. So these kind of studies make us really prioritize things and not waste money on other things, I would say. There are other very popular, now becoming popular methods such as drones, which we also use in Dugong project very extensively. Drones are basically UAV is unmanned aerial vehicle. It is technical name for drones. So drones are used also on land, also in marine. There are underwater drones as well, which can be used for different purposes. So in this image, you can see a dugong, which is a marine mammal I am working on, and I'll be talking about it later a little bit. A dugong and its calf, its baby. So it was a very exciting image for us because this is a marine protected area in Andaman where it is difficult to go by boats all the time. We can't go by boats all the time, be on water 24 hours. So with drone, when my colleague Sagar did surveys, we found a population which is breeding there. So where dugongs are very less in our country now remaining, that's what we are thinking. There finding a breeding population was very exciting news for us because now we can prioritize that marine national park for more patrolling, for maybe understanding dugong behavior there. So it is one wonderful image taken, and we have videos of that also. uh, so it is going to help us understanding dugongs of India more. Then there are I'm not sure if you can see the video, but if you can see, there are lines.
It's playing, so I think it's
Yeah, okay. So there are lines or boxes around the fish, and this is one artificial intelligence project by Global Wetlands Project. They have their website, you can check it out. So what they do is they have created one program where they have fed training data of how fish look like, how a certain fish looks like. Say if this parrotfish has certain type of tail, it has certain bars, or the anal fin say is colored, something like that. So that training data is fed into that program, and now that software is trained to understand what fishes are there. So what they do is they run one video through software, and then you can directly get what fishes are there, and one Excel sheet appears on your screen that these fishes are there. If you they are trying also to feed the behavior of those fish. Say they are trying with normal behavior right now, say feeding or hunting or something like that, which is very obvious. So they are trying those training data sets, and the results are wonderful. Till now the accuracy is almost 85%, which is amazing because when we analyze those videos, you have to sit through that video. So if a video is of 5 minutes, you have to sit for 5 minutes, see the whole video, understand where in the video, say on 1 minute there is a fish, then on 1.5 minute there is a fish. You have to literally write everything in that. So it is very very I would say critical task. And then human errors happen because you get tired. You don't, sometimes the fishes are camouflaged in the habitat, so you might not understand if they are there or not. So this tool, artificial intelligence, is proving really handy for these kind of analysis. It saves a lot of time and energy, plus you can train that software with your kind of training data. So this is Australian lab. So if I want to put Indian fishes, because the diversity is different at Australia and India, I can make my own data sets and train that software for the fishes found here, and then I can upload those videos and see. So it is getting really handy, though it is on experimental basis and getting improved day by day, but it is going to be fun, and I hope I can share those results soon. The next very important technique is genetics, where in my introduction, the Proteus team has said about this paper that we have published a paper saying a mitochondrial phylogeography reveals high haplotype diversity and unique genetic lineage in Indian dugongs. I know it's quite technical and very difficult to understand. This paper is mainly led by our lab colleagues Srinivas Yellappu and Anand Pandey. I was the sample collector. So what happened here is, we were thinking that Indian dugongs are like the normal other populations of dugongs, and so the priority given to those were same as those of other dugongs in the area, say for Australia or Red Sea, where there are like populations more than 10,000, and here we have uh, less than 300 individuals in the whole country. So the priority given to those dugongs were less compared to others. So this study specifically says, I'm saying priority is less because in IUCN the status of dugong is vulnerable, which is a good thing globally. But when in India we say we are seeing decline of population very very rapidly, so it is important to understand the status of them. So this study was taken up by Campa Dugong team, and we found that this green colored circles you are seeing, that is the Pacific Ocean dugongs. This is the right side red colored cluster you are seeing. That is Southeast Asian, the all islands like Philippines, all those islands, that population. And we have found a different cluster which is different from everybody. These on the left side, these are dugongs of India. So we were sure that this cluster is different. So genetically, at some percentage, our dugongs, the Indian dugongs, are different, and that's why they are priority to the conservation by Indian government. So this paper holds a lot of value globally also, because we are saying that Indian population needs that kind of importance and information, which we lack right now, uh, to understand and manage this dugong population. So this genetic studies are giving a lot of information, where species like dugongs or whales or dolphins, where we can't observe them all the time, or we can't live with them all the time, from a small sample we can understand a lot of the biology of that species, and a lot of work is being done on the genetics of different animals. I would like to give one example of one of my colleagues here in Wildlife Institute of India. She is working on rhinos, and she is solving poaching cases of rhinos with help of genetics, which is one success because they have exposed one poaching network of rhinos, and then the case is ongoing. So these kind of studies or these kind of cases can also be solved with genetics while you're not on field or something like that happens. So genetics plays a huge part in wildlife forensics as well, and Wildlife Institute of India is doing that forensics here in Dehradun. So there are many cases they have solved with that. And there is one more thing called metagenomics, where you can take sample from one habitat, say soil sample or water sample, and extract genes of all of the things that are present in that habitat. So from microorganisms to the biggest mammal, if one hair of that mammal is there or something, some part of that mammal is there, we can understand if those species are present there or not. It is one very very tedious process, still getting established slowly, but in India specifically. But it is a very important tool of understanding the habitats. Then there are analysis which are related to what animals or plants eat or what are their nutrients. So those are related to mostly the food or their tissues, but that are also used as pollutant analysis, because now pollution is a blanket problem for everybody. It is really important to understand that how it is affecting the habitats, animals, landscape, everything, because uh, there are things like if you have heard about Great Garbage Patch, I guess everyone should Google it and see that there is a patch in the sea where uh, all of the garbage accumulates because of currents, and the animals live in that garbage. So it's really very unfortunate that they have to suffer through this because of the pollutants we have created on land and thrown into the water. So many turtles, uh, other mammals, fishes, everything those live in that garbage patch have to consume that garbage, and they might eventually die. That biodiversity or that area might eventually just die out. So it is very important to understand how those pollutants are affecting all that wildlife. So there are different types of pollutants like mercury, lead, different metals. So those are uh, analyzed with tissue samples of these animals or gut content of these animals, where if a dead animal, if we get a dead animal, if or we get some part of that animal, we can have complicated lab analysis and check what nutrients are there, what pollutants are there, on what at what levels they are present, if those levels are tolerable, if those are not, if those are lethal. All that information we can get from these kind of analysis, and it becomes very important to humans or food consumers as well, because a lot of this analysis is done on fishes which we eat, and in the end it is going into our stomachs, and then we don't even realize that what we are eating. So it is very very important to understand how these cycles work, how these pollutants come into these animals or the system, and how they are affecting everybody in the sense. So in continuation with that, there are biochemical analysis done on turtles. This is a very specific example on turtles, where isotope analysis were done. So I guess uh, I how would I say isotopes? Okay, so there are some elements which have certain different properties from the normal elements. Those are called isotopes, and those can be analyzed or detected at various parts of one animal's body through chemical analysis, and then we can understand if that animal is consuming something different or what it is exactly consuming. So if we see in this turtle specifically, in blood sample in scutes, those are these shells on the back, and in the eggs, the turtle eggs, there are lead quantities, so which is one harmful chemical which is lethal at more than optimum levels. It is lethal. So this turtle is certainly consuming from a polluted area, and so that becomes very important, as lead pollution or mercury pollution, all that kind of pollution makes this animal prone to diseases, maybe prone to genetic disabilities. As in humans, it is proved that with say radiation or other metallic pollution, humans become prone to different diseases or disorders. It is similar with the animals or plants, so they become very susceptible for dying out. So it becomes very important to understand where all this coming from. First of all, if it is present or not, and then where is it coming from. So these kind of analysis become very important. So these all are the technologies which aid us in understanding the organisms, the habitats, the landscapes, and then have made decisions about it. So it is very very helpful that these technologies are present and we are using those actively for different conservation practices. One very very important technology I want to talk about, and which is a very important part of conservation today, is social media, and it is flooded with conservation things and posts and information. Online world is something that I have experienced specifically this year with the World Dugong Day we have celebrated through our project. And I'm taking a little advertisement opportunity here to say that please follow our handles, where we are giving out information about dugongs, seagrasses, and other project activities as well. So we had a huge campaign in month of May, where we posted every day about dugongs, about marine life, about the work we are doing on these handles, and to tell people about dugongs, to make aware people about that these animals are living in Indian waters and these are important for everybody living in that area and indirectly to us, everybody on the planet. So we made this social media campaign, and I'm seriously proud saying this, that we reached almost more than 3 lakh people through these social media handles. And one important thing that happened was now the World Dugong Day, which was only celebrated in India till last year, is now celebrated worldwide because of the recognition by Convention on Migratory Species. So it is a proud moment for everybody of us, because 28 May was selected as World Dugong Day because India signed MOU for conserving dugongs with CMS, which is Convention of Migratory Species, on 28th May, and now that is declared as World Dugong Day. So this kind of impact we can have with social media. This is one technology now I have first-handedly experienced very very closely. Uh, it gives you reach to a lot of people. Right now also I'm talking on one social media and reaching to all of you, talking about all these things. So it is one very powerful medium, and maybe it is giving a lot of information to all strata of people. So there are a lot of people who are directly interested in wildlife, but there are many who may not be that interested, but through photos, through videos, through these kind of posts or articles, they are getting at least little aware about what is there and what is being done as conservation or in this field by everybody, governments, by organization, institute, everybody. So social media is becoming a very very powerful tool. Also, the Global Wetland Project video I was showing you for artificial intelligence, I got to know them through social media, through a conference which happened on social media. So it is really great that we can have that interactive platform and make people aware about what is there and what is being done. So basically, if we don't know about what is there, we can't do anything about it. So anybody, a normal person who may not be a researcher or in field of conservation, can contribute to that with a information also, with a small information also. So social media helps us doing that, and I'm really happy to see this impact of social media where World Dugong Day is recognized. So while we are at dugongs, I would like to introduce Campa Dugong Recovery Program, which is happening in Wildlife Institute of India as a Campa species. So Campa is compensatory afforestation fund, which was given to four species in Wildlife Institute of India for their conservation. So one of it is dugong, others are Gangetic dolphin, Sangai deer, and Great Indian Bustard. Yeah. So these species are given funds to get to be conserved and to be managed. So dugong is one of those species, and we have right now four components of that program, where research is one component, where we do underwater surveys, boat surveys. Then there are laboratory work happening where you can see a dead dugong. We get samples from it. The genetic paper that happened, that was happened with these kind of samples. It is extremely sad that we have to face these kind of instances where we have to see dead dugongs and literally uh, deteriorated samples, but those are data points in the end. So we get these samples. We also cut the guts of the dugongs and see what they are eating, if they have any infections. So all that kind of research is happening in Campa Dugong Recovery Program, and one paper is out. We are trying to publish many more with our different analysis. So with all the information we acquire from research, we go to outreach, awareness, and capacity building. So, as I said, outreach and awareness is extremely important in conservation, because as you get aware about certain things, you become more responsible about it. So, it is very important for the local communities and for the non-local communities as well to know about what is there. So we conduct different outreach programs, awareness programs, and capacity building programs for different stakeholders like forest department, navy, marine police, everybody, where we make them aware about the dugong population in the area, the seagrasses, other things dependent upon them like fishes, shrimps, prawns, crabs, everything, and make them understand that how it is important. We also conduct programs like uh, the beach cleanup and other, say for uh, say for instance, we have this exhibition where there were around 1 lakh students we reached to, and then we told about different marine diversity, and then they also ask certain questions which give you energy to tell more about the program and everything. So till now there have been a lot of programs locally, online, and one thing which we have started as dugong program, that is dugong scholarship. So scholarship is one idea for the fishermen children. They are kind of marginalized at certain levels. So the small scale fishery don't earn that much. That's why it's called subsistence fishery. So they are not earning that much to sustain themselves, and a lot of school students are dropping out because of lack of money. So what we do is conduct one exam where we teach them about first marine diversity, dugong, seagrasses, everything, and then conduct an exam regarding it. The facts we have given to them regarding it, one exam is conducted, and then scholarship students are selected and they are given monthly basis money to continue their education for 2 years. This uh, s- this kind of policy made us reach a lot of fishermen who go out to the sea every day, and then they can give us information about dugongs, where they see them, if they see any threat, if they see any poaching happening, anything related to the sea which is happening, because the team of dugong researchers is limited to almost 30 people. Those 30 people cannot go every day out in the sea, patrol the whole area. So making this network, this volunteering network becomes very important. And this Dugong Scholarship Program is a huge part of it, where we have reached more than 1,000 people, 1,000 fishermen who give us information literally every day, even if we are there in the area or not there. They make videos, they make phone calls to us and tell if they have seen anything, if something has happened. So it is very it has given us a lot of information about dugongs in the area, where on the right side map, if you can see, the black animals are dugongs, and these are the locations where we see dugongs regularly, or the fishermen see dugongs regularly. So this map is based on the information purely given by the volunteers or the fishermen, local people basically. So we have now prioritized this area in Park Bay, which is in Tamil Nadu, for conservation, and we are hoping that this might happen soon, and there will be one conservation reserve which will be managed by local people, because they are the integral part of it. So we are hoping that will happen soon this year. So this is one very strong conservation outcome, where with a lot of stakeholders, including Marine Police, Forest Department, local people, everybody, we are able to prioritize this area for the dugong conservation. And one very positive thing that has happened in this area specifically, that we have rescued 6 dugongs till now. So the dugongs who got caught into the net, or are not able to go out by their own, so the fishermen and other local people and Wildlife Institute have released those dugongs. So I would like to show you a small video here. Sorry, is it working? Yeah. So sorry for that noise, but it was the boat noise. Uh, so this dugong was caught into one fisherman net. That fisherman informed us like in the morning 4:30. We went there, and with a responsible protocol, we have released that dugong safely back into the sea. So it is one uh, really important outcome, that we are getting to know these kind of things. So what was happening before the project started was, uh, people were selling those dugongs off. So the in certain customs or traditions, there is a tradition of eating these animals. So still people are sticking to that tradition, and kind of eating these rare and endangered animals. So with a lot of outreach and awareness, now people are starting to release them and understanding that importance. So we are also felicitating them via different programs. So these are two really important conservation outcomes till now the Campa Dugong Recovery Program has come with, and we are expecting that more such kind of positive results will come out of the project. So I wanted to talk about the Campa Dugong Recovery Program because it involves, it is a very strong example of conservation program because it involves people. It also involves mitigating strategies for the species, for the habitat, and for the people, involving fishermen, involving their children, forest department, navy, coast guard, everybody in the area, and prioritizing dugongs as for their conservation. So these are the outcomes till now, and I want to share one more case of conservation which I have worked on as a dissertation in my MSc. So this is the plant Ipomia pescapri, which is also called morning glory. Uh, this is a coastal plant. Uh, it lives on or it grows on the sand on the beaches, and it is known to stabilize that sand. So it is kind of important to have that plant on the coast because the coast kind of becomes stable because of this plant. But it had a little problem in Veas, which is a major turtle nesting site in Maharashtra, olive ridley turtle nesting site. So what was happening was, if you can see in this picture, these white colored uh, horizontal roots are destroying were destroying turtle nests. So what these roots are basically, they go subsurface. So in the sand, maybe 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter below the sand, these roots go laterally, roots go horizontally, and they may create one network or a mat kind of thing on those nests. And those turtle hatchlings, or the small turtles which come out of the eggs, they can get caught into that mats. Sometimes, very I would say very rare record, but sometimes the eggs were also broken because of these roots, because these roots go inside the egg, maybe for nutrition, we don't know yet, but maybe for nutrition they go inside the egg and the egg is destroyed completely. So this problem was occurring in that place repetitively. So my ma'am, Miss Sumedha Korgaonkar, suggested me to take up this topic, and I took up it as an SC dissertation. So we monitored these plants. So this is that Veas beach, and if you can see a clear square in between, this was 5 by 5 meter square, which we cleared completely to monitor the growth of this Ipomia pescapri, because it was not seen anywhere else. We asked people in Orissa, where the turtle nestings happen in lakhs and lakhs. So we asked there, there it was not happening. There this problem was not existing. On Maharashtra coast, at some places this problem existed, but it was not as prominent as this place. So we specifically chose this place and see the growth, how this Ipomia is growing. If you can see in this photo, it is literally everywhere. You just see in the photo and you can see Ipomia growing. So we cleared some squares in between and monitored the growth, that how they are growing and why it is very difficult to manage them. So in this photo, the upper horizontal line is the Ipomia pescapri root. It was almost 5 to 6 meters long, and the growth happened around 3 weeks. Plus, where you can see there is no stem or leaves above that root. So it was going from below the surface literally without anybody noticing that it's growing underground and making a network. So if there are no above ground parts like stem and leaves, nobody can guess that this plant is growing below the surface and making such menace on that coast. So we monitored this, and with the Gram Panchayat we came with a strategy for turtle nest, that they always make this kind of hatchery, turtle hatchery, where they take eggs and make them protected with these kind of mesh. So what they now do is they completely clear out the area, uh, digging out the completely dig out the area, so that no hypomia roots can invade that hatchery, or they at least try to, and then continuously monitor this hatchery. After every 3 to 4 weeks, they again dig out the area around it, so that the roots cannot grow, or they cannot uh, invade those nests inside the hatchery. So this kind of strategy was designed specifically for the Vedas coast, because this problem was literally menacing there. So this was one more example for how a problem based solution can be given. So the turtle conservation was happening since years, but this problem was literally making literally being troublesome for the local conservationists there. So we studied it and came up with a solution. So I'm not saying that it is completely successful or anything, but it is still managing that area for conservation. So these are two examples I wanted to give as first hand experience of conservation biology that I have taken, and it is very very learning lesson for me, and I hope I would implement it somewhere else where I'll go next. uh, so to conclude, I would say we have a lot. We have, as a country, we have a lot of things. Let it be terrestrial, let it be aquatic ecosystem, let it be marine. There are so many things to look at, so many things to admire, and so many things to conserve, that uh, always just keeping in mind that balance is the key. N- we can't blame anybody. So what happens most of the time in conservation, that people get confused between preservation and conservation. So preservation is keeping that thing as it is, but when we see natural world, there are processes, it can't be as it is always. So conservation and managing of it would be the best strategy of coming years. That is my takeaway from all these years. And one thing I would like to tell everybody through this quote by Richard Dawkins, that just imagine the banner of headlines if a marine biologist were to discover a species of dolphin that that wove large, intricately meshed fishing nets, 20 dolphin lengths in a meter. So maybe this scenario would happen sometime, I don't know, but yet we take a spider web for granted as a nuisance in the house rather than as one of the wonders of the world. And think of a furor if Jane Goodall, which is a well-known conservationist, returned from the Gombe stream with photographs of wild chimpanzees building their own houses, well-roofed and insulated, and painstakingly selected stones, neatly bonded and moderate. Yet caddies larvae, which are very very small animals who precisely do that, they command only passing interest. So there is so much to understand and so much to admire, that these all little things, everybody, not only conservationists, not only students of wildlife should admire, but everybody who is uh, who wants to admire the nature can look at these things and make their behavior responsible towards these things. With that, I would like to thank all of you to bear me for all this time, and I would like to open this panel for questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Like my knowledge of conservation biology is quite limited. Like it's like I didn't know much at all, and I can for sure say that like I learned a bunch of things today, and I'm sure others
Thank
did as
you.
well.
I
So
hope I
yeah,
have not bored anybody.
it was very interesting. So if anyone wants to ask a question, like you can use the raise hand feature and unmute yourself now. Yeah, Vidya, yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Firstly, it was a very great talk. I mean, I learned
Thank
a
you.
lot of new things, especially the turtle and the weed part. So,
Yeah.
I had a question. Have you ever dealt with poachers? How do you deal with that if you have seen it?
Okay. It's a very interesting question. I have not dealt with them directly, but we have handled one case of dugong poaching where the dugong was poached on and they got caught by marine police. So these people were elderly people, like more than 70 years of age people, and then they literally were shaken by that experience that they got caught. So it was traumatizing. The net and boat was confiscated and they were jailed for a few years. All of that happened. But the impact that case made on the villagers around was tremendous because now everybody fears. But at the same time, we also got to know that those people were so poor that they had no option but to sell that dugong for their subsistence. So, though I have not interacted with them directly, some people might get violent, and then there are these fishermen meetings that happen where people are like, "You don't care about us, and you don't know what we suffer through," and all of that happens. They get aggressive, but in that time, we try to convince them there are conflicts for sure, but we are trying to resolve them. That's what I can say right now. But
Okay,
these,
thank you. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but these are the questions which we need to address. That it is not only the dugongs they are killing, but they are also making harm to themselves by maybe sitting in jail for 4 to 7 years to the whole family. So this awareness made these villagers more cautious now.
Jacob, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so the talk is very interesting. I really liked it. So my
Thank you.
question was somewhat related. So at least here in the Western US, there has been increasing incidents of human-animal conflicts. So there are animals somewhere they use to destroy large amount of so which due to more aggression is there in the world. So how do you deal with such instances? Like for long time there was no such conflicts, at least for some cases, like immediately since ISEC. So what do you do for such cases?
Yeah. So human wildlife conflict is a huge topic and it has a lot of facets to it. So uh, increasing human population, increasing land use or the water use or the resource use, I would say, it needs to be managed. So sensitive areas like Western Ghats, where the area is less and the diversity is so much, one thing we need to understand is we are not different. Like we are not apart from that habitat. We are part of that habitat. Humans are part of those habitat. They cannot be taken out from there and everything will be fine. That is not going to happen because we were there always. It's just that as a species, we are now making a lot of changes in that system. So uh, we need to manage, and maybe a responsible behavior would be the answer to this. So there are a lot of instances where, specifically in Chhattisgarh and those areas, the elephant conflict is a lot, or in Kerala, the elephant conflicts are a lot. But when we talk about giving solutions to these conflicts, it becomes again problem based because So what crops are being damaged, if there is any human loss, if there is any property loss happening, all of that needs to be taken care of. Maybe uh, maybe taking these villages away might be one solution, but that does not work always, because you, as humans, you are attached to that land, you are attached to those homes. So maybe changing your crop patterns, or changing the uh, village structure, or going out timing, small these kind of small changes can also help. So there is one case I would like to share, is in Mumbai, when the leopard attacks were very prevalent. uh, these attacks were happening because humans, they were mainly targeting children, because they were small in size. For leopard, they were small in size, and they were going out at the hunting time of those leopards. So it was very kind of obvious to like that attack to happen. So they made their awareness programs, that how you should not go out at that time, or how a leopard is moving in that area. And now those attacks are reduced. The leopards are still crawling there, but those attacks have reduced. So this one kind of example from one city. So these kind of small changes can also help in conservation of that area. But one more thing I would like to add is, we need to know what exact conflict is happening and why is it happening. Then only we can give the solutions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So you spoke about different methods used for
Yeah.
taking the number of animals in marine area. Like these are mainly for seas. How do you use the same methods for inland freshwater sources and animals there, or are there some different methods for that?
There are many different methods. So methods basically depend on the biology of that organism, the habitat you are studying that animal in. So I talked about marine basically because I am working in marine and taking that experience firsthand. But say for instance, there is one project conserving gold, mahashir in the Himalayan rivers. So they are also using satellite telemetry to check where those fishes are going, where they are breeding, or what areas they are using to prioritize that areas for conservation. Some of that are part of the protected areas like Corbett. Some of that are like parts like Haridwar, which is heavy tourism place. So with that kind of study, they can understand where these species are going, how they are using that habitat, and then come to one solution. So all these technologies, or all these aids I have explained, are used in different contexts, and all these methods can be used variously in different habitats. It all depends on the biology and the area you're working on.
Thank you very much.
I had a couple of questions. So,
Yeah.
seagrass is kind of an important, like it's like the starting point of many of these, like even if you take dugongs, like they graze on
Yeah.
seagrass. So, how is the population demographic of seagrass like changing? How do you conserve? Like, is there a necessity to conserve seagrass? And if so, how do you go about doing it?
Okay, so seagrass is one very interesting ecosystem because they are true plants underwater. They flower, they fruit, everything underwater, and these are very important habitats for dugongs, as I've said many times. Turtles, green turtles specifically, because they eat those. Then there are fishes who use those habitats for hiding, for feeding. Also, shrimps, prawns, crabs, all those are dependent on them. So these are very important habitat. Plus, there are different species which make different covers or different depths they are found at. So these all studies are happening currently. On a global scale, they are thought to be declining. They are with global studies, they are understood to be declining currently with different threats. Pollution, as I've said, is a common threat to everybody. So that is happening. Then coastal development. So like if some construction of jetty or bridges or anything is happening, that is directly harming seagrasses with sedimentation or changing of the currents. That all is happening. So as of now, for conservation, we are doing this awareness, and everything includes seagrasses. We make aware those fishermen uh, that what is the importance of those seagrasses, how you should not harm those with maybe nets or anchors they are using, or any other. By walking in that area also, we use a lot of seagrasses. So that all is one strategy. For many other institutions are trying restoration of those seagrasses, so they are going and planting seagrasses and trying if that is working. So there is not a huge success as of now, but small scale successes are happening, and that might help in seagrass conservation in coming years.
Thank you, ma'am. There is one question in the chat box, and I read it out. Is there any open access database that you can suggest for conservation biology for developing artificial intelligence algorithms for work similar to those of Global Wetlands Project?
So, Global Wetland Project is what I have interacted with, and they are also making now one open access platform. Right now, all these technologies are very expensive, so to say, because one, it is very tedious to make that program and train your data sets. So these are Global Wetland Project is one for fishes. Others I will search and maybe mail you because it's not coming to my mind instantly. So I'll mail you other things if that is okay.
Yeah, that's fine. We can forward it to you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Like, you can type them in the chat box or unmute and ask me.
Thank you, Sri Lakshmi.
So if not, I would like to conclude the talk by once again thanking Ms. Chinmaya for such an insightful talk and everyone present here for making this a great success. I would like to thank our sponsors once again. We're also very grateful for the continued guidance and support of the School of Biology and our faculty advisor, Dr. Sadananda Singh, who have made this symposium possible. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another set of amazing talks by Dr. Anil Shaji and Ms. Mala Thapa at 4:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. respectively. Thank you and have a very good night.
Thank you so much for having me.